All right, well, I want to welcome everyone to another virtual walking tour here for the Clark County Historical Museum. So again, my name is Brad Richardson. I am the Executive Director at the Clark County Historical Museum. And today I have Battleground historian Louise Tucker here with us, helping us to guide along, and also Dr. Cal Clark, who grew up in Battleground, to help us with our tour today. Before we get started, I just want to let Louise and Dr. Clark introduce themselves a little bit. So Louise, you want to talk about a little bit regarding Battleground history that you've been involved in? You've wrote a book about Battleground history, right?
Yes, I wrote Battleground in and around. It originally was a project from the GFWC Star Junior Women's Club, and then we sold the first batch of books as a club, and then people still wanted them, so I published it on my own since then.
Nice.
I've just been interested in history for a long, long time.
And Dr. Clark, you grew up and your family's from Battleground, correct?
That's correct. My family moved from Kansas in 1936. I was born in 37, and we moved to Battleground right around that time into the old Mickey house on Main Street, which was built in 1902. And then I graduated from high school there and sort of moved on after that.
Nice. And so obviously, Louise, having wrote the book on the history of Battleground, can you tell us a little bit about, one, why is it called Battleground, and two, how did this city get its start?
Well, first of all, it could have been called Peace Ground instead of Battleground. Let me just read to you what was on a sign and is now on a mural. A battleground. This area was named after a battle which never occurred between Klickitat Indians and soldiers from Fort Vancouver in 1855. The Indians promised Captain Strong that they would return, but excuse me. Chief Umtouch was accidentally killed, and the the captain. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm shaking so much I can't do this, Brad.
Oh, no worries at all. So what happened is there was the band of Klickitat, correct, that went, and they ended up going, and they were pursued by Captain Strong. And what ended up happening is that they eventually caught up with them, and there was an agreement that they were going to come back to the fort. But during some part of that event, Chief Umtuk was actually killed, and the Captain Strong actually ended up saying that the band could remain, and that they would end up coming back to the fort on their own. And so there was this potential that there was going to be a battle, and it was referred to as Strong's Battleground for many years. And then eventually the name was shortened to Battleground, and that's where it eventually got its name. And what's interesting about Battleground is that it's actually kind of these two developments that started off initially. There was a northern development that was kind of north of where we see Main Street today, and there was one on the southern end, and Augustus Richter was actually the person who established the one on the southern end. He laid out some of that land, and the one to the north was referred to as Dublin, and there was obviously Irish immigrants up in that area, and the one to the south was Maple Grove. And eventually the city just kind of continued to grow. People started to come in and establish themselves. And what's interesting is that Battleground was a city that was operating for quite some time, but unlike most of the other Clark County communities, which incorporated, Vancouver incorporated 1857, Camas in 1906, Ridgefield in 1909, Battleground actually didn't incorporate until 1951. Dr. Clark, do you have any memories of that period of time at all, or of your family back in that time of the incorporation?
Well, I remember for the first time we were electing a mayor, and there was, as usual in a small town, there's a few factions here and there, but we came together, and all of a sudden we started having more improvements in the city as far as roads and infrastructure. So I really favored that. I'd like to take a little aside.
Yeah.
When I went to Boston to school, people would ask me where I was from, and I'd say Battleground. And they, as Louise said, did they have a fight there? And I said, no, there was never a battle fought there. They said, well, Battleground, isn't that where they make the dry cereal? And I had to explain, no, that's Battle Creek in Michigan.
So the name has been a little confusing for people. And so the first building that we're looking at, this has some old history. So this is currently Old Town Battlegrounds. It's a coffee shop, but it was the Sacred Heart Church of Battleground. It was built in 1928. And it's, you know, when I drive down, and I don't know for how you two feel, but when I look down in Battleground and I see kind of like the real historic buildings that stand out to me, this one always stands out because it just has a really nice style to it. And this church was to replace the church at Dublin, which was about 2 miles north of this location. And the land was donated, and Louise, you may have to correct me on this, I may say it wrong. It was Bernard LaRoche, I believe, was the name of the individual.
LaRouche.
LaRouche, there we go. And so he constructed he donated the land, and when the construction was nearly completed, Mr. LaRouche actually passed away, and they actually hurried, from what we can tell, to finish the floor of the church, which would enable him to actually have his funeral out there. And then the rectory next door and the belfry were added later to it. And the rectory in 1940 ended up being, you know, constructed, and it replaced eventually both buildings were replaced by a new church on North Parkway, I believe. And do either of you have any kind of memories or thoughts on this building?
I was just glad to see that it was never torn down, that it had a new purpose, and that the congregation is still very alive and well north of town.
And it just serves as a center point to the town, I believe, as Louise said.
Yeah, and Louise, you were mentioning that there are offices now in the rectory, and so they've been repurposing, which is nice. It has the Old Town Battlegrounds is in here, and then also the rectory here. Are there any other churches of significance in the community? Obviously, we can't see them all physically, but like, are there any other congregations that of historical importance?
Well, the Methodist Church, which when I was growing up, and probably Cal, you too, it was a community church, not aligned with any denomination. And it seemed like most of the high school kids that were churchgoers would go to that church. It was a social gathering place.
And so, speaking of the Methodist Church, this building actually has a connection to that. This is built in 1935, and this building is, from what we can tell, about 680 square feet. It has 1 bedroom and 1 bathroom, and we refer to it as the Crab House because in 1934, Mr. Crab, who was a Battleground Junior High School principal, actually purchased the Methodist Church building located down the street and repurposed some of that wood to actually construct this home right here. And you know, it's funny. It's this little tiny house on Main Street Battleground that you probably, if you're zipping by, you'd never notice. But it has this funny little story, and it's kind of the tiniest home on Main Street, I think. And from here,
I'm not sure if it's still, it was a beauty salon. I don't know if it's a commercial building now or not.
You know, I think it probably is.
I don't see any signs, so
yeah,
perhaps it's back to being a home.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, you know, a lot of these buildings, like we were talking about with the church and we were talking about with some other things, they end up getting repurposed as offices, which is, I think, a nice way of being able to keep the history around without without having to lose that. And let's zoom a little forward. So this one is the Stith House. And this was built around 1920. And actually the first owners were the Thorgersons. But eventually Horace Stith purchased this property around 46, and he was an accountant, and he was the first treasurer of the city. And do either of you have any memories or information about Mr. Stith?
It's interesting that you call him Horace Stith because he was always H.A. Stith. We never heard his first name.
And that was common back in the day, that people were referred to by their initials. And And so it's funny when we go back into history and we end up finding their name, and then we call them that, thinking that's, of course, that's what they were called.
He was known in the community as Bud Stiff. Of course, as kids in those days, you always called them Mr. and Mrs. You never called them by their first names.
Yeah, there was a respect factor there.
Yeah, there was.
And then Louise, this is a sculpture by Jim Dimitro. And Jim, so you have a little bit of background on who he is.
Well, he was an engineer, but he was dabbling in art in various mediums, and finally he just decided that's what he wanted to do full time, and he's made a successful life of that.
Yeah, because he actually did the statue of George Vancouver that's down in Esther Short Park, and then also in Battleground, I think he probably did the pieces that are up by, and I'm not certain if he did, but I think he probably did the pieces that are up by what was Mill City Creek pub. And then this is Dr. Skinner's house. So Dr. Clark, you were telling me a little bit about Dr. Skinner and some story that you knew about him and Mr. Stiff.
Yes, Dr. Skinner had his clinic here, and neighbor, of course, was Mr. Stiff, and they were good friends. And Dr. Skinner had become a pilot, so they took a trip fishing to Vancouver, actually not Vancouver, but Williams Lake, British Columbia. And they fished and they took off, and it was a little foggy, and he didn't pull up the plane quite in time and crashed the plane, and they escaped, the one with the back injury. But ever since then, that area is known as Skinner's Butte in Canada.
We were joking, that's how you leave your mark on the world, right? Oh, and Dr. Skinner was a very interesting figure. He was actually born in China in 1907, and his father was a missionary, and they returned to the United States in 1916, and he arrived in Battleground in 1937 and married his wife in 1938. And we're getting up to the park, but we can talk a little bit more about Dr. Skinner's house, and then also your own house when you were growing up, Dr. Clark. We can pause here to talk about that, because we were noting just before we got on the feed that Dr. Skinner obviously had his house and his practice in the same place. And that was the same with your father. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, the office was directly connected to the house.
And you were saying that you were talking about how your father would close up for the day and you'd sometimes get unexpected visitors.
Yes, there was a door that closed off the office from the remainder of the house, and sometimes people would come in and not knock and just walk right into the kitchen, and he'd have to sort of say, "I'll finish my dinner." "Oh, sorry, Doc, I'll wait out in the waiting room." Another one, they would come into the house, into the office sometime, loggers would, wearing their caulk boots, and that doesn't do well with linoleum floors in the office.
So now we're looking at what's now Central Park for Battleground, but originally this lot was owned by Peter Onsdorff, and we'll talk a little bit about Peter Onsdorff when we get close to a building there. But in 1908, it was purchased by a Mr. Morgan, and he built Morgan's Meat Market at this location. And then eventually in the 20s, John Hash purchased the building, and there was a telephone office ran at this location. And you were saying that it's kind of behind the bench near the creek. Talk a little bit about that telephone office, Dr. Clark.
Well, the office was a little small outbuilding, which was a maze of wires, because this is where Mrs. Hash, she was known as Nanny Hash, would use the plug-in switchboard, and she had a line to every person in Battleground, and she knew what was going on more than any person I've ever known. But she was our contact, because this was before cell phones, and you had to leave a number if you were on an emergency call.
And they had, your phone number was what?
Our phone number was 32, and then they developed the 7-digit numbers, and you had to remember more numbers. But we either had a private line or a party line, and party lines could get rather interesting.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, well, I think that for some of our viewers, they probably don't know what that is. So explain, what was a party line?
A party line meant that a number of phones were connected to the same line, and when you use it, it would ring one time or 2 times, but once it rang, you could pick up your receiver and hear other people on the same line.
So there was no privacy if you decided to answer for someone else's ring. It was honor system, right?
It was the honor system. Yes.
And it wasn't always honored.
So at this location, from what we can tell, is after 48, there was a drugstore, a bakery, there was a house. Obviously, the Hash home was here. There was a donut shop. There was a music shop. There was one reference we found to a hippie store, which we're uncertain what that means, a real estate office, and an optometrist. And then eventually the park was developed. And Louise, can you tell us a little bit about just the park being established here?
Well, it was Maggie Culbertson who tried to put the thing together. And it was quite a struggle for her and some friends to put that together. We thought that we could clean up the creek and have a nice little walkway and some brickwork and all that, but there were restrictions against doing a lot of improvements, so-called improvements. So the creek still looks much like it would have been if it was just outside of a city somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, there's a sculpture there. There are park benches that have been donated. It's a nice little park right in the middle of town.
And Dr. Clark, you were saying if we walked to the end of this path, we would have reached or been near the home of someone of importance to Battleground.
Yeah, the path would connect to First Street, and there was a guy who was a fellow who was the manager of the co-op, which we'll talk about later, and his wife Florence Robinson was, I believe, the postmistress, and then quite an advocate for the city and just a very activist person in town. And when I grew up, that First Street didn't exist, and you had to walk a plank bridge across the creek. Let me say that Wooden Creek could become a torrent, and it had a lot of flooding from time to time in that little stream.
I have to say something too about Wooden Creek. It's not E-N, it's I-N, and it's named after a man named Mr. Wooden, and he was one of the first mail carriers in the area. And he lived up near Battleground Lake. And sometimes you will see old maps or new maps even that say that the little creek in town is Wooden with an E-N, but it's Wooden with an I-N. And that's confusing sometimes, but map makers aren't necessarily 100% correct.
No, and Mr. Wooden was described as the old, faithful, and unforgettable character, silent, modest, having a generous and kind-hearted way of doing things, doing favors for patrons. I mean, this is from your work, Louise. And it was noted that he would sometimes, and this is thanks to you, that he would often carry off the record notes to young sweethearts along his route. So
I remember hearing that, and I thought that was neat.
Yeah, which is it's just funny to think back in the day how young folks who were maybe at a distance would have a relationship or anything like that, and they would send these love letters to him. And he was praised by people because he would get the list of items from Vancouver, and he brought them back on the return trip. And
Right.
He was just
And
a
that was
very
out of the
interesting
goodness of his
fellow.
heart.
And then this building here is where Music World at. Music World is a nice battleground business. They actually were part of our music exhibit that we have up, and actually I can announce it right now. Is we just received word from the Washington State Museum Association that we won an award for our music exhibit. So we're an award-winning museum now, and Music World was a part of that exhibit. But this here is the Onstarf Building. Louise, do you want to tell us a little bit about this one? Yeah, because this is on the Onsdorff property, and Peter Onsdorff, originally he owned everything from the start of the creek all the way down to Clark Street, and we actually have a pretty large collection of stuff from Peter Onsdorff. And he was born in Sweden. He homesteaded on Bell Mountain near Battleground in 1888, and in the mid 1890s, he actually, after his cabin burned, Onsdorff began operating a store in Hawkinson for a period of time. But what he saw was the Vancouver, Klickitat, and Yakima Railway plans were starting to be revived around this time, and it was going to run through Battleground. So he ended up moving in around 1902 to Battleground with his wife Ida, because they wanted to be close to the train, and they purchased the property on Main Street. And Onsdorff built and lived in a store at first, and then eventually continued to expand. And he was postmaster from 1901 to 1907. He built a blacksmith shop, and then he built a Studebaker wagon store. And Louise, is it correct that this is probably the one that was the Studebaker wagon store?
Yes, a part of that. I think there's some flooring in particular that is covered up now that was part of that original building.
And this whole block, right, was pretty much, and we're looking at the building right now. So some of these buildings, you know, they get overlaid over time and different things end up getting put on them. And Peter Onsdorff pretty much owned everything all the way down. And towards the end of the block, he had a house, right, Louise?
Yes, it was a grand house. There's a picture of it in the book I wrote, and it's quite Victorian and ostentatious for this little town.
and the Onsdorffs were pretty prolific to Battleground. I mean, they, you know, Onsdorff was a school board member. Also, he was a leadership in establishing the first Christian church, which later merged with the Battleground Community Church and United Methodist. And Ida actually passed away in 1915, and Peter passed away in 1936. But they also had a son, which we'll see his house much later. But we were doing research for this tour. We looked back at the aerial photos, and we saw that Peter Onsdorff's house was there until not too, pretty recent. It was probably the 50s. The house was still standing, and then eventually it was replaced by a building that would become the post office on the corner. And you were both kind of talking about different places the post office were at. Dr. Clark, you remembered where one of the older post offices were located.
Correct. Right as you keep going, we're going east now, and past the next big street, which is Clark Street, not named after me, was the post office that I recall going to as a child. And then it moved into this building, which was, as we're passing now, in about mid-40s, I would suspect.
Yeah, and the post office was there your entire childhood, and then eventually it moved to a new location, correct?
Yeah, this one was the one that we're facing right now is where the original post office was, and then the one just behind, and then now the post office is out on the west side of town.
Yeah, and
which at the time it was built, some people said, well, that's not in town, that's too far out.
That happens. The building that we're in for the museum, when it was built in 1909, there was a big, the people were kind of upset for a reason, because they said that the building was so far out of Vancouver, and it sits up on 16th Street in Vancouver, so it's not that far out of the original downtown. But these cities changed, because this is really the old core of Battleground. I think a lot of people, they recognize the Safeway, and they recognize kind of that main corner with a lot of commerce that's there now, but this was kind of the core of early Battleground, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And so from here, we're going to zoom a little bit forward, and we're going to go to what was the Battleground State Bank, and then the Reek store. And this building is, originally had a building here at 1903, and then eventually there was a store built here later on. And the store that's here now was designed by Hillborn. And the Reek brothers operated a store out here. And you both said this was the B&G variety, right? For a number of years.
Yeah, there was a variety store after the mercantile, after the grocery store that was run by the Reeks was no longer used and sold. They had the Battleground variety store there for years.
So what would you, a lot of people don't necessarily maybe know those kinds of things like 99-cent stores or dime stores or variety stores. What would you go to get at a variety store?
Well, it was like a Woolworths, except on a small scale. And when we would have, my nephew and nieces would come down from Longview, they didn't want to spend much time with us, but they wanted to take their purse and go to the variety store because they could buy candy and they could buy gym cracks and they could buy nickel things. I don't know if you can buy anything for a nickel anymore, but that was their favorite place to shop.
And there were sewing notions and little toys, and everything was in a bin, as I recall. And so you know, you just kind of lean over these tables, these bins, and pick out your stuff.
Yeah, and the entrance for the building used to be different, because what we can see here, if we look, this brick, you see this is what's called Roman bricks. You can tell this building is kind of 1950s-esque, 1940s, 50s. And you see where the windows lined, and there's a line right here. That's actually, there used to be an entrance on the corner of that building. So it's always one of those neat architectural things that you don't realize when you're looking at a building. And do either of you happen to recall who ran that the variety store? After
the family name. The family name was Ihus, Oihus.
Yes, that was one of them.
That was one of the families.
Yeah, was this their main business in town, or were they involved in other stuff?
And Libertorch did too.
Okay.
Remember Libertorch?
This was their only business in town. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is a pretty hopping corner, because if we turn around, we see Alan Ernie's, and we also see, you know, kind of off to this side would have been where there was originally a elevator. Was it?
A grain elevator.
Grain elevator. So Dr. Clark, there was a fire that broke out on this corner. Actually, a number of fires broke out on this corner, but July 14th, 1952, the Dairymen's Association grain elevator burned to the ground. And well, first thing, there was something special about that grain elevator. What was important about that in relation to Clark County?
It was the tallest building in all of Clark County.
And unfortunately, it caught on fire and burned. And so, Dr. Clark, you were telling me about the day. You remember that day?
Yes, it was in the middle of a July Sunday, if I recall. And we were out at Louisville Park playing baseball. And somebody said, hey, look at the smoke. And there was this black smoke coming out of Battleground, and everybody rushed in. And this 150, 175-foot building was aflame. And luckily, the wind wasn't blowing from the east, because it probably would have swept all the way west through the town, because most of the buildings in town were frame buildings. And that fire was left to go out, and I think it took a month to get the fire out, because there was molasses stored in the bottom, and it just kept burning and burning and burning.
That's incredible. And
they saw it from all over Clark County.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it caused significant damage. Eventually, it did topple, and it ended up destroying the older Alan Ernie's, and then eventually Alan Ernie's rebuilt this one. And do either of you know a little bit about the background on Alan Ernie's?
Well, they're two brothers, the Dunnings, but I don't know much. I worked there a little bit, in high school senior, but it just became that they were very great supporters of Battleground in the schools. Louise probably knows more than I about them.
I think they were cousins rather than.
Oh, were they? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, they're cousins, the Dunning cousins. It was always just a really friendly place, and when you go there, it wouldn't be a turnover of a lot of people. There were the same workers there year after year, and they had the best produce anywhere.
And was it kind of a main grocery for the town back in those early days?
That and the co-op. The co-op probably had the biggest store. And the co-op wasn't just a grocery store or a milk place. They had dry goods. I remember when I was in junior high and had a home ec class, I walked from the school down to the co-op to get some yard goods for the first thing to sew in that class. And there was hardware, there was paint, it was an everything store at the co-op. So the Alan Ernie's would be more like a shop and go.
Okay.
Well,
And so,
Brad, let me interject here. One of the things about the location of the building, most of us didn't grow up with street numbers and avenue numbers. You knew that this was Main Street going through town. And when you wanted to go to Battleground Lake, you turned left at Allen Earnings. That was, I don't even know the name of or the number of the road that went out there, but that's how we used to tell people directions.
It was Grace, but not everybody knew that.
I
And it was a pretty significant landmark. And then this building here is interesting because this was the Battleground Theater, and it had a larger two-story building that was built by Augustus Richter in 1903, but then eventually around 1911, Steve LaRoche ended up purchasing the property, and then in 1918 he built the theater at this site, and he actually generated his own electricity to power the projector and operated out of there. And so, Dr. Clark, you remember growing up and going to this theater?
Yes, and it had a crying room upstairs. So if you had a small child that wasn't quite trained to behave in an adult society, you took the child upstairs, and it was sort of soundproof. It was also damp at times when the rain would flood up. The lower part of the theater would be under about 6 inches of water.
See, I would imagine if they had like an old Pirates of the Caribbean movie, they could have played it during that time. That could have been the splash zone, right? They could have played up on that. And then you actually worked here. This was one of your first jobs, was at this theater, correct?
I worked there. My job was cleaning the restrooms, and I'll never forget, I saw my first and greatest graffiti when I was 15 years old. There was a sign on the wall, and it said, "Please do not throw cigarette butts in the toilet. It makes them soggy and hard to light."
Oh, and this was a theater well into, later days. So, I mean, this has been a business. It's been a bar for a period of time, but it was a theater. When do you think it ended up being a theater? Probably.
Oh, probably in the after I left. I mean, I left town in 55, and I'm sure it was still going until 60s.
Yeah, and it had this interesting dome look to it, which I haven't seen with any other theaters in town. And so then the next building here, you were saying that there was a restaurant in this brick building that was owned by a pretty prominent individual.
Yeah, his name was Harvey Johnson, and he was a mainstay of the town. If there was something going on, he would be in the middle of it. He was the announcer for our Harvest Days parades, and just a very sociable fellow.
And then
there's also, about Harvey Johnson, there's also a place near Battleground called Hazeldale, and many of us remembered going out to Harvey Johnson's Steak Burger. After he left Battleground, he became the proprietor of the Steak Burger and the Garden Golf, or whatever they call that.
Yeah, miniature golf. Yeah,
miniature golf.
Had one of those. One of the first ones around.
Oh, that's incredible. I had no idea. And then here, and I learned how to say this correctly today, and I think I will, is Dimens Drugstore was at this location. And Dimens, they moved to Battleground from Independence, Oregon in 1936 and opened the first pharmacy to fill prescriptions. There were some other places, I think some of the doctors you could fill pharmacies, but I guess this was the first formal one. And in the latter part of September 1955, Dimens Rextel Drugstore was opened in Battleground, and it held its grand opening in this space that we're passing. And the new store installed a large recessed window, had lower shelves and fixtures, and the store was given a grade A rating by the state pharmacy board, which always cracks me up that they got a grade A, because I wouldn't want to go to a grade B pharmacy. I would be worried about that. And then there was a large crowd actually that attended, of about 2,000 on that date of the opening. And it's noted that 900 orchids were imported from Hawaii and given away. And they said that it was one of the biggest volume of sales days that they had ever had. And so it's just a pretty interesting opening with that. And then from here, we're actually turning around and we're looking at what used to be also the Battleground State Bank for a period of time. And there was a bank that sat here originally, and there was actually a robbery. And Dr. Clark, you were saying that you had a family connection with that that robbery?
My father's office was right there across the street, and I remember them talking about the fact that they had a lot of excitement in Battleground that day. Not every day had a lot of excitement in Battleground, but there was a bank robbery. And I don't know what the details were, whether they got away with a significant amount of money or what was going on. There was nobody shot or killed as far as I know, but everybody said, I wonder if my money's safe in that bank.
So we were lucky. We were able to look it up. So we have some records that we found about the robbery. So it was on Tuesday, December 31st, 1946. It says it was an exciting day for bank employees and some customers at the town of Battleground when there was a holdup. And it says that 3 armed men, one masked in a red handkerchief, entered the bank and held up the employees and customers of the bank. And the 2 bandits entered the bank and forced the employees and customers into a back room where they held them at bay. And one man stayed at the wheel of a stolen getaway car, which was parked at the curb. And the holdup was made in a matter of minutes before the time lock on the bank vault closed at noon. And after putting all the employees into this office, the robbers ended up vaulting the counter to get the bank receipts. And present at the holdup was actually Mr. and Mrs. P.L. Rasmussen, Betty Lou Walls, her name later would be Sergeant, and then L.P. Ritchie, and some customers. And H.A. Steeth, local income tax advisor and also first city treasurer of Battleground, entered the bank while the robbery was happening. And one of the bandits snarled at him and said, "Keep on going, buddy," and motioned him to the back room. And so Mr. Steeth actually ended up raising his hands and complied immediately. And after that, a chase ensued. So the robbers ended up smashing into a parked car as they fled away from the scene of the robbery at very high speeds. And a deputy United States Marshal, Ed Brandon, who was in the bank at the time of the holdup, he actually took chase in his own car after them. And they ended up almost twice the car nearly went off the road and swerved as they tried to get away. And a quantity of canceled checks were apparently thrown from the stolen car and were recovered. And it was reported that about $18,000 was stolen, with a portion of it that was recovered. And the bank was obviously insured at this time. And roadblocks were actually set up, and the entire sheriff's force and state patrol went to look for the robbers. And the FBI was put on the case. And 2 months later, they ended up arresting the individuals who conducted this. And it was on December 30th, 1947, that ground was broken and the construction of this bank here that you see was started. So this was in the previous bank that stood at this location, but that they ended up moving on from. So that's kind of the play-by-play of the excitement of that day and that bank robbery that ended up happening.
And Brad, I think that the safe that's in the current building is still in that building, even though I think they built the newer building around the safe, because it was pretty big and not too destructible.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that people's deposits were probably safe in this bank during that time and afterwards.
P.L. Rasmussen, who was in the bank at the time, later became the first mayor.
That's what I was thinking. And do you know a little bit about Mr. Rasmussen?
He was quite an entrepreneur. He ran the bank. I know he made personal loans to people as well. He owned quite a bit of property in town.
Yeah, and it's a pretty prominent name. I mean, I think is there a road named after him?
Yes.
So this is the Cressup Garage, and this was brothers John and Robert Cressup built this in the 1930s, and the lower floor was a garage and a headquarters for a trucking company. And they were actually grandsons of Robert V. Cressup, who was an early person who came to Battleground, the Battleground Lake area, and he was also a Civil War veteran. And Robert Cressup actually was one of the ones who blazed the trail along Wooden Creek in the 1860s to his homestead. And I guess there were apartments also. Do either of you have any memories of the Cressup Garage?
I do. A number of the teachers, unmarried, well, maybe they were married too, but a lot of the teachers in Battleground School lived in the Cressup apartments. And my good friend delivered newspapers here, and he would always talk about, well, I ran into our teacher when I had to collect money for her newspaper.
So you have a memory from when you were a kid of doing that.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. So the next building we see off here to the right, this one was constructed around 1955, it looks like. And it was Thor Weatherly moved his TV business into this building when it was constructed in 55. And prior to that, he had been located in the Cressup Building. And Weatherly installed and serviced TV sets. And he was in business with Jake Jacobs for a time. But then eventually, Emil Beckhold bought this building and moved into that. And Beckhold was born in Nebraska in 1910 and ended up marrying Mildred Thompson in Vancouver in 1938. And Emil enlisted in the United States Army in 1942 and served for the duration in World War II. And in 1964, he became the third person elected mayor in Battleground and held that until 1974. And he was known as Dutch. It was a nickname that he had. And he passed away in 1984, and Mildred passed in 2001. And his grandson still runs Barrel Mountain Brewing inside that building there. And then the building we were just looking at, you were saying that was a shoe store or shoe shop for a period, right?
John's shoe store. Yeah, he made shoes, sold shoes, and then got into all sorts of leather goods.
Good repairman.
Western wear. Beg pardon?
He was a good shoe repairman.
Good. Yeah, good man.
And then this building here, this isn't the building that housed it, but this was the location of something that was pretty unique to Battleground, which was Edna's Ice Cream Parlor. And Louise, can you tell us a little bit why that was unique?
Well, it was, there was a platform that was built out over the creek. The creek goes right through there, which is covered up at this point. Anyway, they served ice cream outside on little table settings on this platform over the creek. Sounds really romantic, doesn't it?
Yeah, we actually have an image in our collection. I wonder, let me see here with the power of the internet. I bet you I can show everyone because we got a second before we go to our next site. And let's see, this will be the Research Olympics that I'm conducting right now. Can I pull a photo up fast enough as we're looking at this site? Oh, you know what the big problem is? I have to spell things correctly. Edna. So this here is an image.
Right.
So as we're looking right here, you see the creek. Everyone can see the creek and the house right there. And if I pull this photo over, you can see right there, there's that platform and there's the creek. And then here's the older building. So just imagine, coming out to Battleground and sitting on Edna's ice cream platform to have some nice ice cream. And, it was a pretty popular place of entertainment from what we know. There was also a roller rink, a dance hall, a coffee shop and cafe. And what they remember at this location was that Edna's ice cream.
Well, that's a staple,
Yeah.
ice cream.
Well, and speaking of, things being cool, we have Sheldon Onsdorff's modern meat locker here that was built in 45. And Louise, you were telling that you had a little personal experience with the meat locker that's over right here in this part to the left.
We lived in Pleasant Valley, which is 7 or 8 miles from Battleground. But we had a meat locker here, and you would rent some space. They were like little cages. You could see into them. And that's where you stored all your frozen food. And then you go there periodically and get some, bring it home.
Because you weren't able just
to go. It had a unique smell too, because it was also a place for farmers to hang their meat, hang their beef or wild meat if there were hunters. And that, along with the refrigerant smell, it was just something I can't explain, but if you ever smelled it, you know what I mean.
And Dr. Clark, do you have any memories of this place?
I do. On a day when it was very hot in the summer, it was a very grateful experience to walk into the meat market and go into the sub-freezing area and sort of while away 5 or 10 minutes until you cooled off before you got your hamburger or your steak out of your meat locker.
So you took your time.
Took your time there.
And it's funny because people don't realize this. Like when you had stuff in the meat locker, you know, it wasn't like you could just go to the freezer or to the ice box necessarily and grab a big piece of meat and cook that up for dinner. You had to kind of prepare for this, right? Because you had to be able to go down the meat locker, get it, and bring it home, and then prepare it. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't fast food.
Had to plan.
But it was totally welcome on hot days, right?
Oh, yeah.
Very nice.
So here, the next thing we can see across the street is Sheldon Onsdorff's house. And Sheldon Onsdorff was the son of Peter Onsdorff, and he was born in 1906, and he was married in 1931. And this house was designed by Day Walter Hillborn in 1934. And Louise, do you have any information or anything you know about Sheldon Onsdorff particularly?
Well, Sheldon is the one that had the meat locker across the street there. And that building had later become the office of the Chamber of Commerce for a number of years. But what's something that's interesting, according to Judy Ost, who was one of the owners of the building, that it is haunted. And
oh, wow.
So, if you want to check that out, you might check with the current owners, see if they had anything rattle around.
And this one also had didn't it have a little kind of gazebo out the front until recent, and then a little lending library out there too?
Yes, it did. And the lending library has been moved up to South First Street, just west of, what is that street? Parkway.
And you're involved with the group that did that, is that correct?
Right, yeah, that's a registered Little Free Library. And so when you go to Little Free Library on the internet, we have a number, and we keep it stocked as well as we can. It's used quite a bit.
And
bring a book and take a book.
And what's the name of the group that helped establish that?
It's a GFWC Battleground.
What's that
And
stand
we have
for?
a brand new website.
What's the acronym stand for?
General Federation of Women's Clubs. And
Nice.
It started way back in the 1890s in the East and moved quickly to the West.
And how long have you been involved in the Battleground Club?
I'll just say over 50 years.
So tell us, just as this is a mural, so this is kind of a nice little backdrop, but do you mind telling us a little bit about your work with the Women's Club?
Well, we've always been interested in history, but we also are interested in the arts, and we give a prize to one of the artists at the annual show that the Art Alliance puts together. We're interested in health, we're interested in friendship, just a good all-around group of club sisters.
And one of the things, because you've worked on a lot of projects, we see over here to the right, we see that Battleground float. Can you tell us a little bit of the history of the Battleground float? Well,
that started in 1955, and that was the 100th anniversary of the battle, the peace that happened. And so it consistently had been in the Portland Rose Parade all those years until this last year, when Portland no longer did not have a parade for this year. And we're hoping to revive it again for next year. We'll see what the pandemic does.
I have an addition, if I might butt in here.
Yep.
Brad, that 1955 was the year Battleground Band marched in the Rose Parade for the first time. We had wool uniforms. It was over 90. It was, I don't know, 4 or 5 miles, 50 miles. And we were right behind the horses. That'll give you an idea of what kind of footstepping.
And you were one of those in the band.
And I was in the band. And a couple of guys and I, when we got through, we went to Battleground Lake, and this is in, middle of June. And that cold water never felt so good. That was the first time and the last time I've been in a band parade, but it was quite a treat.
Oh, and that float has been a lot to the city, right, Dr. Clark?
Yeah, like Louise said, that this is the first year in 50 years, 60 years that they had a parade.
Yeah, and so this building here is the Dairymen's Association building. So, and you were saying that this is a place where you could go get groceries and so much more. And the Dairymen's Association was been really important. Either of you want to kind of talk about the importance of the dairy history in that Dairymen's Association?
Well, part of the main economy of this whole area was dairy farming. And so the co-op was it was the central business in town. There were probably more people working at the co-op than any place else. And the schools weren't that, didn't have that many teachers in it at that time. So I'm sure that it did hire the most people.
And then it had a cheese operation in there too, right?
Oh, yes, in fact, they were so known for their cheese that the first basketball and football teams were called the cheesemakers. And that's a little cheesy, huh? Anyway, it was the central business of town. They had a repair shop. They had a gas station. Of course, the feed mill at the other end of the town. So it was a big operation.
Brad, when the operation closed, the former general manager of the Battleground Cheese Company, or maybe before they closed, was named the general manager of a cheese company called Tillamook. And he went, and they had cheddar cheese in both places, and his name was Beale Dixon. And we'd stop at the cheese factory on the way home from school, and if we knew somebody, we'd get some fresh curds of cheese that they'd give us a few samples. But like Louise says, between the school district employees and staff and the cheese factory, everybody else lived on small farms. And now very few farms left anymore.
Yeah, because Battleground, I mean, was really one of the bigger farm-based communities with a diverse, set of resources that were being farmed. I mean, you had prune industries across the area, you had potatoes and Ridgefield, but Battleground with the Dairying Association, I mean, it was a big deal out here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then this house, is it correct that this one was home to the Chamber of Commerce for a little while, Louise?
No, not that one.
No, not that one.
That's where Old Town Battleground started.
Oh, in this house right here?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, nice.
And it's an antique store now.
Yeah, and it's nice to see all these little homes that are being repurposed on Main Street Battleground, and you can go in and have an antique store, you can have a coffee, all kinds of fun stuff. And then we're gonna head around the corner here. It's always got these nice big plants here blocking our view. We'll get past here. There's another house. I think you both recognize this one.
Yeah, that's the Hanson House, and that was the home of the Reflector for several years in the 50s. John and Olivia Dodge lived there and operated them. It was called the Mid-County Reflector at that time.
Because it started out as the Ridgefield Reflector, correct? Right. And then eventually it moved to Battleground, right? And it's been in Battleground since?
Right. Although the main offices now are up north, either Centralia or Chehalis, I forget which.
Mm-hmm.
Just a point, Brad, when Louise and I were growing up here, the population of Battleground, before it incorporated anyway, were 750 people.
That's
that
right.
Probably includes dogs and cats. And I believe now, Louise, correct me if I'm wrong, it must be 22,000 or so now.
I think that's very close. Yeah. I know we live just a mile north of town and we're getting surrounded with houses.
Yeah.
And what do you feel has been like the biggest change to Battleground that you've seen over your lifetime?
Well, just the increased traffic. I live in Vancouver now, and to come into Battleground used to take me 20, 25 minutes. It now takes me 45 minutes if I'm lucky.
Mm.
Yeah.
And so this next one here, we're going to zoom forward a little bit because we talked about the Reek brothers, but we also had Mr. Reek, and he was manager of the cheese factory.
Right. And I believe that's the reason they came to town, because he was hired as the manager of this big operation.
And Dr. Clark, you were talking about that there was another house near here that had a tennis court that the family had.
Yeah, back across the street was a place, and there used to be a Battleground clubhouse right behind there, and the old tennis court with the high chicken wire fences around it. I remember scrambling around that one as a small kid.
Yep, and this house was the home of Henry Reek, and he was an immigrant from Germany, settled in Battleground in 1911, and as the general manager of the cheese factory, that was one of a very, very large producer of cheese, and he contributed to the economic growth of the Clark County Agricultural Association. And the home actually got listed on the Heritage Register in 1998. And it's very interesting background on the Reek family. And then we also have the Anderson Dairy now, because that was what eventually I think took over from the co-op, if I'm correct.
Yeah, they bought it from the co-op, yes.
Mm-hmm. And now you have Andy's food basket here. And then Louise, we're walking up on this sign. So this has significance. Can you tell us a little bit about the significance of that sign?
Well, when the city sold some property that the original wooden sign was on, there just didn't seem to be a place to put up that sign, and it was starting to deteriorate. So this same GFWC club that I belong to had Miss McGee, and I can't remember her first name. Anyway, so she painted a mural of the sign, and so that's where the sign tells the story of Battleground's naming at this point.
Yep, and then we see on the mural here we have a whole bunch of other pictures, and that original sign, you actually were the one who routed out the words, right?
Well, yeah, I learned how to run a hand router and routed the words, and then painted white in the incised lettering,
Mm-hmm.
and then painted the redwood color on the rest of it.
And
the wood itself was kind of interesting because we got it from a local logger who had taken down some trees in front of the Memorial Hospital in Vancouver. They were cedar, or they were
redwood
trees. And so at that time I was married to Bill Allworth, and we had a sawmill. So we sawed those logs up. And so that's the story of the wood that original sign was made of.
And from what I was told, you did that freehand. So you didn't have like lines on that wood. You did all of that writing freehand.
Oh no, I drew some lines on.
You drew some lines. Okay. I'm glad we could set the record straight. And then the last place that we're going to look, I'm going to zoom forward just a little bit, is I think a really important house to Battleground history, which is the Richter home. And we kind of see it here coming behind these trees. We can't get a super good view of it. But this one is interesting because, and let me scroll so I have my information here. I'm going to pause just so we can see that home right there. So this one is a very early home. It's one of the earlier homes that I'm aware of in town. And you can hear me stalling just a little bit as I furiously scroll for my notes because I'm a little out of order today. But this one, it's a real top-notch production we're running here at all times. So this is the older structure, and on the south side of First Street is the back of the Augustus Richter home. And not long after he purchased this a small home and a store from someone, he ended up adding a larger two-story addition to the building. And the front of the store and the home faces the old road that used to follow Wooden Creek. And Richter actually established a post office in Battleground from 1892 to 1901, which eventually later was moved north to the Onsdorff store. And it's talked about after the addition was completed on this home, there was ample room to rent rooms in the home to drummers and traveling salesmen and other visitors to the area. And Mr. Richter was said to be a gourmet cook and entertained his guests by playing piano. And it's even speculated that he may have operated a speakeasy on the premises, but this hasn't been substantiated as far as I know. And then in 1903, the property was sold to William Dixon, and it's been in the Dixon family ever since.
It's 1 o'clock.
And Louise, do you have anything to add on that one?
Well, just the kind of the look of the whole town. When you look at the town now, there are a lot of trees. But if you look at old pictures of Battleground, the trees had all been cut down and it was all flatland. And so when we think old, we think of the landscape too.
Yeah. And Dr. Clark, as we're kind of wrapping up, is there anything that you'd like to share that we missed today?
No, but some things haven't changed. My wife, whenever I get on her nerves, she say, you know, you can always take the boy out of Battleground, but you can't take Battleground out of the boy.
Oh, that's fantastic. And Louise, do you have anything else you'd like to share as we kind of close up?
Well, history is happening today. So keep track of what's going on. If you feel like it, write about it.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you did. And one of the things definitely to let people know is that you have the book in and around Battleground. We have a couple copies for sale at the museum. And then right now things are closed, but are there any places where else people can get it for sale, Louise?
Well, yeah, actually Battleground Auto License has them and they are open to a limited number of people at a time, but that is one main place that, and also the Old Town Battlegrounds, you have to ask for it. It's not right out in the open. And just recently, it's been put in the North County Museum at Amboy, but of course they're not open at this point.
And what was the name of the first place? There was a noise. We missed that one.
The Battleground Auto License Agency.
Nice. So Battleground Auto License Agency, Old Town Battlegrounds, North Clark Museum, and the Clark County Historical Museum all have copies that you could purchase of in and around Battleground. And this is the book everyone goes to find out Battleground history. So if you want to pick up a copy, you should definitely check that out. And Louise has done an amazing job putting that together. Louise, Dr. Clark, thank you again so much for joining us on the walk today. We really appreciate it. And this closes out. This is our last walk of our main season for our walking tours. So I just want to thank everyone who's joined us every Friday at noon for a virtual walk as we continue to bring some history to you in the community. And I just want to thank everyone. And you can check out all our past walks both on Facebook, they're still posted, and also on YouTube. We end up reposting the videos up there, and you can see the fun that we've had with I want to thank Pat Gelada. I want to thank Nan Henriksen. I want to thank the Old Town, or the Old Library Inn in Ridgefield and Kristen. I want to thank Dr. Clark and Louise and everyone who's joined me, so I didn't have to sit here and talk to a computer by myself every Friday. It would have been kind of weird. So I want to thank everyone for the whole season and everything, all the support. And if you like what we're doing and you're on the feed, please join as a member of the museum. We definitely need your support during this time. Membership is just $40 for an individual and $60 for a family. So it's, one meal out, really, what would be the amount of one meal out definitely makes a significant difference on our ability to be able to continue to do our work. So thank you all for joining us, and we will see you on tours later.